So Brother Lawrence, who spent his life
Mhm.
working toward that and to being in the constant light and presence of divine love of God, um, he says the presence of God is an applying of our spirit to him or a realization of his presence, which can be brought about either by the imagination or the understanding. So he's saying, right, both of them are real ways of being in his presence. Initially, most of our spiritual life, it begins in the imagination because we've got such deeply wrong ideas about the nature of being that we have to imagine God's presence, imagine God's companionship. But what we think we become, it manifests. Imagination is the doorway to creation. It's the way things are created. It's the way that things are manifested in this physical world is through that imagination. And I always like to point out that, that here I sit in this house, but go back 100 years, I'd be sitting in a field. It's imagination alone that manifested this home. And so using our imagination in our practice is a very powerful tool and shouldn't be downplayed. Quite often, at least in the West, we kind of downplay imagination as almost the toy of children kind of thing. But it's not. It's the very birth of creation, creating things, of bringing things into the world. So he says you can do it by imagination, by walking with God, by talking with her, by writing notes to her, by leaving little gifts for her on the shrine and such ways. But he also says through the understanding. And this understanding is when we take a look at the nature of God, at Satchitananda. This is the one that gives me the most comfort and gives me the most, at least, has convinced me so strongly in the experience of the presence of God, is knowing that Satchitananda, that existence, that we exist because God loans us His existence. We've talked about that noun and verb, but I'll repeat it because it's important to understand it. That God, Brahman, God without form, the one without a second, the highest ideal of God, is noun. That God does not exist. God is existence itself. And what does that mean? That means that our existence, the fact that we exist, we are the verb, we are the manifestation of God's existence, of God as existence. So it indicates to us that God is our existence, which is an immense clue to the intimacy, to the fact that we struggle to keep God in our mind, but that the divine never forgets us, because to forget us for even the split shave of a second, our existence would cease to be, since it is because God is existence that we are able to exist. And it's the same with love, that God is not loving. God is love itself. We are the verb. We are the manifestation of that divinity. So we are loving. And the fact that we recognize love and can share love and express love is because of the intimacy of the presence of God within us. That ability, that verb, that action of love is only because of the presence of God. And this idea of wisdom or intelligence, that God is not intelligent. God is intelligence itself. And the fact that we can take these different inputs through 5 different senses, taste, touch, smell, hearing, and seeing, that we can combine those and cross reference those and create an understanding of the world around us, create an understanding of self. Uh, that ability to decode information into intelligence, into meaning, is because of the presence of God. And so this notion that we have to go look for God or that we can't see God just means that we don't have any idea what God is, because everything that we do requires that intimate presence of the beloved. We would not exist. We could not love or be loved. We could not know if it was not for the presence of God within us, where he gives us all three of those gifts from his own nature. It is an indication of her presence. And so when we're feeling separate, that's why the Buddha said, go in and follow your breath. Why would you follow your breath? It makes you aware of your existence. I like that idea that in the book of Genesis, in the Christian scripture, that when God created Adam, the body was there and it was lifeless. And the way that he brought that body to life is, it says that he bent down and blew the life breath into the nostrils of Adam and gave him life. And I like to take that notion from Sri Nisargadatta that the world is created new at every moment. And in this moment, every time you inhale, that is the life breath of God keeping you alive. It is God's intimacy. You can imagine him right there, breathing his breath of life into your nostrils, giving you this experience of being, giving you this experience of presence. And so this intimacy that we come to know God is through understanding, through knowing God's nature, and being able to detect it within ourselves. Those things that we know, that we shouldn't know, that I've mentioned many times. We should have no concept of immortality, because there is nothing in the manifested world that can teach us immortality. So how do we know it? We know it because we are immortal. We know it because we bring that knowledge into the world with us, that immortality is a divine quality. The other one, infinity. We should have no concept of infinity, for there is nothing in the manifested world that is infinite. And yet we know infinity. We can conceive of it and have no problem with it. The idea of beauty. What is the point of beauty in a world, a material world? How is it that we know something is beautiful? Who teaches us? No one teaches us beauty. But beauty is a name of God. It is part and parcel of being united with the beloved. So it's through these understandings, through these ponderings, these contemplations, that we become aware of exactly how fundamental the presence of God is to our very own presence, that the two cannot be separated. We cannot be apart from God. We cannot be outside of the love of God. That if we were even for the shaving of a moment, we would cease to be, we would cease to exist. And so it's quite wonderful when you're sitting in meditation, if you're having a difficult meditation or you're simply not feeling connected with the divine, to just remember these things. Remember the evidence that God has given us and has been so consistent in sharing with us that we're able to forget it, that we're able to filter it out like a background noise. We forget about the miracle of an existence, the fact, what does it even mean to exist? to realize that we can forget about our intelligence because it's so constant and so steady, that we can actually forget about love, because it's everywhere and so common, that these things become white noise to us. The mind filters them out so that ego can operate more freely and more wholly on itself without the awareness of God, without the awareness of the presence. And so by contemplating these things, we grow in our understanding, not just through imagination, but imagination demonstrated through our physical experience, through the manifestation of the divine. He says, I know one, in number 2 here, he says, I know one who for 40 years has practiced.
Maharaj, sorry to interrupt you, but can you please read the heading of that portion that you are reading?
Of the presence of God?
Of the presence of God, or the union of the soul?
Of the presence of God. Of the union of the soul with God is the previous one.
Okay. I'm sorry. Did I miss something? Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right.
Okay.
Is it in there? I don't know if all copies are the same. But
Yeah, but we finished the other one, right, Maharaj?
yeah,
The
well, yeah,
union of the
we had
souls.
a little bit more to go, and I took a look at it and thought
Okay.
we can move on to the next section.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Maharaj.
No need. It's all right. So number two, he says, and of course he's talking about himself here. He's just being humble. I know one. I know one who for 40 years has practiced the presence of God intellectually, and he gives it several other names. Sometimes he calls it a simple act or a clear and distinct knowledge of God. Sometimes an impression or a loving gaze or a sense of God. Yet other times he calls it a waiting on God, a silent conversation with him, a divine repose, the life and peace of the soul. He says, however, that all these expressions for the presence of God are synonyms. They express the same thing, that presence which has come to be natural to him in this way. So he talks, look at those and compare them and see them as synonyms, how rich they are there. That God, that this being, the practice of the presence is a simple act. There's no complexity to it. It's simply placing the mind on your own awareness, which is God, your own isness, the I am, right? That's your presence, that's your existence. You know, when God says his name is I am, that is something for you to remember. You chant the name all the time. Every time you say anything about yourself, you start with the name of God. I am hungry. I am tired. You know, the I am part is the divine impression, that image of God that he has placed within you. You always have to reference that. And then you add the human quality, that which makes you an ego, that which makes you special or separate. You string those on afterward. So you always start with the fundamental. The fundamental is God, I am. And then if the body is hungry, you'll make the mistake and associate that quality with the I am hungry. But in fact, you are, and the body is hungry, you know. So like that. But to always hear it anytime that you say something, you chant the name of God, and to become aware of that. That is how we become. That's how we become established in this prayer of the heart. To pray without ceasing is to come to realize that our very existence is our prayer, and that to become conscious of that constant prayer, the prayer of our thought, the prayer of our words, the prayer of our actions, that these are all constantly going on, that we're constantly requesting of the divine, either in thought, in word, or in action. And to become aware of that is how we practice this unceasing prayer that the pilgrim in the way of the pilgrim that he was seeking for. So it's in a matter of a realization and awareness, a realization that we don't need to pray without ceasing. What we realize is that our very life is a prayer without ceasing. And our focus, bringing our mind to concentration, is to become aware of what our prayers are, so that we can pray something consciously with our full being, with single pointed attention, and that God always answers those prayers, right? So for 40 years, he's been practicing the presence of God, which is a simple act or a clear and distinct knowledge of God. It's just putting your mind there. God is. God is. I shared this morning in class. I had a wonderful time last night as I was laying there falling asleep, just repeating to myself, the grace of God is real, and trying to associate that with my sense of being, to feel the grace of the universe surround me, to feel the grace of existence surround me, to feel the implications of a grace that is infinite and complete, and to relax into that notion, and just to keep saying to yourself, the grace of God is, oh, excuse me, the grace of God is palpable. It is real. And by saying it again, it's not that you convince yourself. By saying it to yourself again and again, what you do is you continue to open to it. Each time you understand it a bit more. Each time you stretch the implications a little bit wider in your heart, you say it with a little bit more sobriety, a little bit more of a deep resonating understanding. And so, yes, the grace of God is real. The presence of God is real. And you become aware of it by focusing on your awareness, on your ability to be, on your love. That's why we go to the heart to do our meditations, you know, and to understand these presents. Sometimes it's an impression or a loving gaze or a sense of God. So you can have that sense of God within. Or you can sit there in the shrine if you want and do a loving gaze through the image at the God behind it, in the same way that you can sit and lovingly gaze at the sunset, through the sunset to the divine behind it. To let everything that you see and experience inform you of the presence of God. Anything that you see, to look through it and see the presence of the beloved behind it, is an amazing practice and is what he's talking about here. Yet at other times he calls it a waiting on God, that you're just sitting there listening, constantly listening to God, listening to learn, listening for answers, listening for teaching. And it comes from all directions. You can go out to the beach and go sit on a bluff somewhere and say, God, teach me something. Show me something now about yourself. And then open all of your interior windows. And don't cognate, don't let it happen in the mind. Don't sit there and calculate out something God just taught you. Oh, God taught me this. No, let it come. Let it come up from behind you. Let it come up from the presence of the divine within you. And listen to the day. Listen to living. Listen to being. And become aware of this beautiful presence that we filtered out so many years ago in the noise of living, the noise of doing. Calls it a waiting of God, a silent conversation with him. I like this one, to really make it a habit, not to just think to yourself where you're the listener and the thinker. Bring mother in and let her watch your thoughts with you. Have a conversation with her about what's going through the mind. Have a thought, have her presence when you're making plans and discuss them in your mind. As you're walking down the street and you're saying your mantra, say it to mother. Turn to her, your internal eye toward the divine, and say, oh, mother, oh, mother, oh, mother, repeating that name over and over. So this silent conversation, this waiting on God, this presence, this simple act of putting the mind, the attention on the presence, on being. A silent conversation with him, a divine repose, a divine rest. Go inside. One of the things Brother Lawrence said in his last letter is that as many times as you can in a day, stop everything. Go into rest. Go into your center, your shrine of the heart, and repose. Just go there and take a deep breath and forget all of the story of the ego, all of the story of what's happening or what needs to happen, what means what, and just be present and center yourself again in the midst of divine love, in the midst of divine grace, in the midst of divine mercy, in the midst of this divine love, which is our very self, the very thing that we exist on. The life and the peace of the soul. So that thing which makes your soul living is the presence of God. The fact that the soul has life and is enjoying this, whatever it is, this wild ride through the Disneyland of the world, that is God. That's the divine company. He says, however, that all these expressions for the presence of God are the same. They express the same thing, that presence which has come to be natural to him in this way. And he goes to number 3. By repeated acts and by frequently recalling his mind to God, he has developed such a habit that, so soon as he is free from external occupations and even often while he is still busy. His very soul, without any forethought on his part, is lifted above all earthly things, maintained and as it were upheld in God, as in its consummation and place of rest. This is that mature practice. We're at the point of trying to form a habit of recollecting God, of not forgetting the presence, not letting the mind filter it out just because it's so steady, just because it's so unchanging. It's just isness. But to constantly keep ourselves awake so that any time that there's a lull in activity, the mind is instantly just soaring right back up there again, that is where you rest. That is where you live. The shrine of your heart, this place within you that is the worship hall where you see the unchanging you, that part of you that hasn't aged, that part of you that hasn't changed with the body, that part of you that is able to keep track of a mind that isn't stable for a second, a mind that's always changing, to go in this shrine and find you, that part of you that has always been there. And from that shrine, from the image in that shrine, from that Satchit Ananda in that shrine, let it manifest. Let it come through you without the ego directing it, without the mind naming it and classifying it and metering it. Let your love be infinite. Let your divine repose be infinite. Let let your worship be infinite. So by repeated acts and by frequently recalling his mind to God, create this habit, this presence, this knowledge of the presence, so that any time that the mind is left idle, it just instantly returns to the presence of God. That's what the mantra is meant to do, but we have a habit quite often of just letting that be rote, and it doesn't really take us to the presence. It just becomes an exercise that we do. But that doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means place your mind at the feet. Realize that the mantra is not just the name of God, that the mantra is God. When you say Om, it's not saying the name of God. It's invoking the presence of God. It is God. And so when you sit there and say your mantra, allow that to be true. Sit there and ponder, what does that mean? The mantra is God. What does that mean? Because the name and the form cannot be separated. If you say the name, the form is present. That understanding of the form will grow in you. Ultimately it takes you to transcendence because the mind is not big enough for that presence to fill. The mind, that's why they call it transcendence. At some point, it's in the silence behind the mind that God is. It's in that infinite repose of peace where God dwells. Which is why the sages all say a peace that transcends understanding, a peace that is beyond the mind. It's beyond the relationships of mind. The mind is just a set of relationships between objects, a set of thinking, thoughts. But God, the notion of God, the immensity of the divine, is before that. Is before that. So lifted above all earthly things, maintained, and as it were upheld in God, as in its consummation and place of rest. At such times, faith is nearly always with him, and his spirit is satisfied. It is this which he calls the actual presence of God, which includes all other kinds and much more besides, so that he lives now as if there were only God and himself in the world, which is very close to the truth. The ultimate truth is there is only God. But of course, as practitioners, as bhaktis, we want to taste sugar. And so for us, we know there truly is only you and God in the world. Everyone else, for you, from your perspective, from your ego self, is merely a projection. You cannot verify their existence. I don't have Kamala in my mind. I have the concept of Kamala in my mind. You don't have your husband or your wife or your children in your mind. You have concepts of your husband, your wife, and your children in your mind. In your universe, there are only two for a while, yourself and God. And what a marvel that is. What a beauty that is. And then ultimately you come to realize, oh, there's no necessity for maintaining this separateness. There's just love. There's just isness. There's just God. And the body no longer works according to a will of egotism. It simply operates in the spontaneous movement of God. So he says here, where are we? Above all earthly things, at such times faith is nearly always with him. His spirit is satisfied. It is this which he calls the actual presence of God, which includes all other kinds and much more besides, so that he lives now as if there were only God and himself in the world, conversing always with him, entreating him at need, and rejoicing with him in 1,000 ways. That's just sharing every aspect of life consciously with the beloved, with the divine. Quite often we make the mistake of thinking that we are experiencing our life in our body. But it is God who experiences it first, and the ego becomes conscious of it or takes account of it or takes credit for it secondarily. So actually, before you feel your pain, the divine feels that pain, you know. And then you become aware of it. We jump up and grab the frisbee that's been thrown to God, as it were. The ego jumps in and experiences life, but it is God who's living. It is the divine experience. And so that's a beautiful intimacy to remember when you pray. You don't have to pray and describe everything to God in words. You just have to open the heart and mind and know that God can peer in there and see it firsthand more clearly than you can, with a deeper understanding than what we will ever have. And so know that this is real and constant, and that intimacy between you and the lover, you and the divine, is at least that intimate, where every sensation and experience that you have, God has lived it first, and then you put your name on it. To become aware of that, to live accordingly, to sense that and know that to be true. Conversing always with him, entreating him at need. So, he's sharing your thoughts. It's that presence of the Divine Mother in there. I've talked in the past that you can take care of 1,000 things by having Mother present in your mind. As you look at the mind, you third party your mind. You're like, Mother, look at that mind. Look at the condition. Look at the struggles in that mind. Look what it does to me. Look how stressed I am. Look how much anxiety, how much fear is in me. Look at that mind, Mother. And then you become aware of that presence. And you also become aware of your separation from mind when you do that. And so you do that with everything. Converse with the divine about everything, about what you need, what you hope, what you long for, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. And you can do all of that without a word in time. In the beginning, we have to talk. In the beginning, we have to spell it all out for God because our faith isn't that great. But later, we're like an old married couple. We've told all of our stories. We've said everything that needs to be said. It's just enough to open the heart and know that God is there seeing. God is there answering. God is there providing. Entreating him in need and rejoicing with him in 1,000 ways. So it's not just describing and asking, it's rejoicing, being glad in him for everything, And what does that look like? Well, perhaps if you're in pain, that you become amazed at the ability to experience even pain. that these negative things. There was a woman 2 weeks ago, I think, on YouTube did a little talk on that. She was saying, even in the worst parts of my life, I focus on how amazing it is that I can experience, that I can exist. And she said, those bad things in my life make me aware as much as the good things do of my ability to experience, my ability to exist, and how mysterious that is, how infinite that is. And so it's always like that. When I was seeing a therapist, she would take me into those places in the mind, where I would feel the depression. And she would say, go in there, feel it, pretend you love it, embrace your depression, love its presence, you know, and then you can become aware of it instead of opposing it, instead of pushing against it and suffering from it. You accept it, and you accept it lovingly. You embrace it. This is existence. This is experience. And so even in that, you can rejoice that it's pointing at a miracle. It's pointing at your ability to exist and be and know. Now, it should be observed that this communion with God is held in the depth of the soul, at its very center. All right? Depth of the soul, when dive deep, it does not mean think deeply. It means go behind thinking. It means that to experience this presence of God, you can't or you don't objectify it. You don't put it in front of you. You turn your entire self into an ear and feel the implications of being. Feel the implications of I am. Feel the presence of God, in that way, because God cannot be placed under a looking glass. He cannot be placed in front of the senses. So dive deep. You should know, it should be observed that this communion with God, this togetherness with God, it doesn't happen here. That's not where it is. It's happening here, before thinking, before identity, before ego. It should be observed that this communion with God is held in the depth of the soul, at its very center. It is there that the soul speaks heart to heart with God, amid a wonderful peace, wherein the spirit experiences the keenest joy. All that goes on outside is no more to the soul than as a fire of straw, which the more it flares, the sooner it is burned out. And rarely little do exterior concerns disturb this interior peace. Yes, remember what the Gita told you about your nature. It cannot be wetted, it cannot be burned, it cannot be disturbed, it cannot be added to or taken away from. It is a steady, unchanging manifestation of love, wisdom, and being that is always available. But it's not in the changing mind, it's not in the changing body. It is before your very sense of identity. It's before the thought in the mind. And so it takes us some time to find it, but that's our beginning practice. That's the first thing we have to do. We have to find and become aware of this unchanging self that exists in the infinite silence and peace of the soul, of the self. And that nothing outside can endanger it, can inflict anything on it, can do anything. The only thing the outside world can do is distract you from it. And unfortunately, that's what it often does. Unfortunately, that's what often happens. We get pulled off the rock. We get pulled off of the unchanging self by the changing world, the big waves that came up and washed over it, and we went diving into the ocean with it. So he says, yes, wherein the spirit experiences the keenest joy. That joy, that's the bliss. You say keenest joy, that means focused joy, the finest, the subtlest, the most intense joy, the very essence of joy. And so the word bliss. All that goes on outside is no more to the soul than a fire in straw. Just burns quickly, it'll be gone in a moment. This life, this body, its problems, its hopes, its dreams, its longings, gone, gone. You don't realize that. That's the gift and grace of old age, is it begins to make you more aware of how short this existence in the body really is and how quickly it really goes. You know, it's it's one of my favorite things to think about, actually. When I sat and realized I've been in the monastery 24 years now, and I think, God, that went fast. I still remember joining. That was not so long ago. And then I add 24 years to my life, and I'm what, 72 years old? Wow. And 24 years went like that. It's going to go like that again. I'm going to be sitting here an old man, before you one day, bald, probably bald down the middle of my cheeks. These huge things, when they fall, they're probably going to dangle down around here. And I'll be sitting there talking about these same things again and again, that we become aware this outside world, it's like burning straw, but that can't even come close to the repose within, to the security and to the isness of being, an awareness that cannot be taken away. Which the more it flares, the sooner it is burned out, and rarely and little do exterior concerns disturb this interior peace. That's what we call being established, right? To be established in God is to be able to not be pulled out, that you can remain there. Somebody can be screaming in your face, accusing you of all kinds of things. You don't get hooked. You know that they're talking to a body and mind, but you are unreachable for them. You exist established in this peace and bliss within. And when it's your turn, you calmly give your retort or your response. No need for getting caught, no need to accept their gift of anger. Let it go, let it burn out, let it be. You always respond to life from this tranquility. You don't react to life, you respond. But to return to our own consideration of the subject, I tell you that the lovingness of God insensibly kindles so burning a flame of love in the soul that embraces him, that one has to moderate its outward expression. Look at Thakur, Sri Ramakrishna. There you see what happens to the body when you respond to the lovingness of God. When you're able to find that shrine within, that essence of self which is unchanging, and you open to that divine love, you become aware of that divine love. Thakur, look what happened. He had to moderate. He had to come up with little tricks in order to stay out of samadhi. Oh, I need a glass of water. Oh, I want something sweet. He said even to chant the name of God, he had to come down several stories in order just to chant Om. And so these are things that these advanced souls have to learn, how to moderate bliss, how to how to bring down the volume a little bit so that they can function in this seeming world, so that they can teach in this seeming world. He says, so to return to our own consideration of the subject, I tell you, and this is a man who's been practicing it for 40 years, I tell you that the lovingness of God insensibly, for doesn't seem logical. Why would this happen? Insensibly kindles so burning a flame of love in the soul that embraces him, that one has to moderate its outward expression. This is your destiny. This isn't just for holy guys in scripture books. This is your destiny. You will come to a point at some point, either in this life or maybe some other one, but I would imagine even in this life, that you will come to the point where you have to learn to moderate your joy, to moderate your manifestation of this bliss, because you have discovered the reality of God within. And what an amazing thing. He said, we should be surprised if we knew what converse the soul sometimes holds with God, who seems so much to delight in such communion that he allows anything to the soul which desires to rest in him and in his heart. That heart that heart that loves, that embraces the divine like that. God, that's what Mother says, that God hesitates to give us unconditional love. He hesitates to give us love, to give us devotion to him, because when he does, he becomes beholden to us, right? He can't resist us. It's like your adorable children. It's like, oh, mom, can I please? And you're like, oh, okay. that's that's the real relationship with God. That he is that loving self. He can't resist the heart that embraces him. Can't resist the soul that holds on to him. The soul sometimes holds with God, who seems so much to delight in such communion that he allows anything to the soul which desires to rest in him and in his heart. And, as if he feared lest she should return to the things of earth, he is careful to provide for her all that she could possibly desire, so that she finds within herself a banquet of heavenly delights, though she herself has done nothing toward it and brings it only to her happiness. You know, brings to it only her happiness, which means that God gives you all of this, gives you this existence, gives you this ability to love, gives you the ability to know, gives you the ability to see beauty, all only to watch your happiness, only to turn to him with that delighted eye. That's all. That's all that he gets in return, that she gets in return for this gift of life. It's just that look in your eyes. You know, there's some wonderful YouTube videos of kids getting the very thing they wanted for Christmas, and that look that they give when they realize what it is. It brings you to tears, right? Because you have God within you. You know that feeling. That also is the gift of the divine, to witness that and to know that. And to know that this is the nature of that relationship, should you spend time to become aware of it, should you make the effort to quiet down your life and your mind so that you can hear this presence, experience this presence. And the only payment is your happiness in the presence of God, to share with the divine your delight at his presence. The presence of God is then the life and the nourishment of the soul, which by God's grace may attain to it by the following means. All right, so he's going to jump into the means here. So that this presence of God is the life and nourishment. It's what feeds the soul. What does that mean? It's what makes life worthwhile. It's the presence of God that gives this mundane life meaning and depth, that gives it profundity, that gives it adventure, that fills it with mystery. And so when we get caught in the material and things seem so regulated, things seem so mechanical, seems so computerized and programmed, it's at that time that we dive into the heart, become aware of the presence, and suddenly the most mundane activity can become worship. The most mundane service can be worship, and we feel and respond and live in the divine, which is our nourishment and our hope and our life, which by God's grace we may attain it by these means. All right, get ready, pull out your pencils. Means for attaining the presence of God. This is what everybody's been waiting for. The first means is a great purity of life. What is purity of life? It's a life in its highest form, devoid of me and mine, right? It's a life lived for others. It's a life of Buddha. It's a life of Jesus. It's a life of Ramakrishna, Krishna. It's a life that is simply there for others. I remember one time years ago, I was how do I talk about this? I don't know. So if someone is considering suicide, if someone was considering suicide, that it's knowing that if you have the courage to commit suicide, if you have the wherewithal to commit to committing suicide, how much better would it be to take that courage and that wherewithal, and since you've determined that you don't need your life for yourself, that your life does not have a value to you, how beautiful would it be if you can take that courage and that resolution for suicide, and instead of killing the body, give your life to others. Go get a job and give that paycheck to somebody else if you don't want it. You know, go live a life and do it for others. And it's a marvelous insight into what it is to be human, because this giving is what we are, right? One of the first lessons of this life is that there's nothing to take from this world. You're not here to accumulate. If you were here to accumulate, you could take it with you. But you can't. You come in with nothing, you walk out with nothing. So what is the lesson in that? You're not here to get. What are you here for? You're here to manifest divine love purely. That is the meaning of life, and that is what makes life beautiful and satisfying. Unselfishness and emptying out in love for everyone. So get rid of this sense and concern for me and mine. It's always thee and thou. So this is the first thing. A great purity of life is necessary to experience this. Now there's a secret to this. And the secret is that there is a substitute for this. You don't have to wait until your life is greatly pure in order to experience the presence of God. What you have to develop in that case is your faith in the grace of the divine. To give yourself permission to enjoy the presence of God, even if you don't deserve it. To give yourself permission to sit in the presence of God without shame, even if you don't deserve that lack of shame. Because your nature is divine. That's why Vivekananda says, constantly repeat to yourself, I am divine, I am ever free, I am ever pure, I am ever loved. To repeat these things over and over, because it is by that grace alone that we know God. And that grace will also fulfill this requirement, not just in covering our lack of purity, but also by inspiring us to a greater purity, to a greater selflessness. So this should not be a dismay that the first one is impossible. Don't be discouraged, because even in this, God is your life. God is your hope. God is your beloved. The second is a great faithfulness in the practice of his presence and in keeping the soul's gaze upon God quietly, humbly, and lovingly, without giving away to difficulties or worries. So it's a steadfastness through your day that you don't forget God. It is the purpose of your day to remember God. And we do that by service. We do that by self-control. We do that by minimizing our distractions. We do that by turning our actions into worship. We do that by becoming aware of our prayer, our life as prayer, so that we are constantly drawing our awareness into the circle of God, into the circle of divine love, divine presence, divine being, divine wisdom, over and over. And we do it quietly. We do it humbly. We do it lovingly. We do it easily, right? It's not something we have to force or pound down. It's something that once you light it, it will catch fire and flare. Why? Because that is what you are. You are love. And put your awareness on love, it's going to catch fire. Put your awareness on your intelligence, on your wisdom, it catches fire. Put your awareness on your existence, it catches fire. So it's a faithful, constant placing your awareness on the presence in the heart, not leaving the shrine room. You live from here, not from here. If you're in the world of the changing, you're up here. That's where all change happens. Change happens in the mind, the impure mind. But that unchanging, it is here. that which does not change, which is not conditional. So you live here, and action is inspired from there. It's not calculated and executed from here. That's the world of change. It sits here quietly until there's an inspiration to respond to the conditions of life. And then once that condition is taken care of, it sits again in silence and humility and fulfillment and joy, and then makes the next response as it's appropriate, always with perfect objectivity and surrender to the divine. So, number 3, he says, take care that you begin your actions, continue them, and finish them with an inward lifting of the heart to God. Wow, there's a tall order. So your actions, you begin your action, you continue your action, and you finish your action with an inward lifting of the heart to God. You offer all that you do. This is the essence of karma yoga right here. You offer everything continually to the presence of God. So you lift it up immediately. I remember my fingers got slammed in the door of the family car when I was probably, I don't know, 6 years old or something. And my Aunt Elsie was there. Her first response was to grab my hand in her prayer hands and immediately begin praying to the divine, just immediately, and holding me and just trying to comfort me. And I remember what an impression that made on me. How many years ago was that now? 50, 51, 52 years ago. And I still can feel her taking my hand in her prayer and holding it in front of her mouth and feeling her breath as she prayed earnestly to God, that my hand wouldn't hurt, that I'd be okay, And I just remember the intimacy of that moment, the beauty of that moment. So that is what this life is. Everything that you're doing while you're starting it, while you're doing it, and while you're finishing it, it's held in your hand and held up to the Lord, held up to divine love, as a gift, as an offering, as a response to grace, as a response to this very, very, very generous gift of being. So that to take care that you begin your actions, continue them, and finish them with an inward lifting up of the heart to God. And as it takes time and trouble to acquire this habit, so you need not be discouraged by failure. As its formation is difficult, so will your joy be great when it is attained. Right? That's a beautiful ideal. Don't be disappointed by failure. That's one of his great teachings, I think, is that he says whenever his mind wandered from God, he didn't get himself concerned about it. He didn't go chastising himself. He simply brought the mind back, just simply brought it back again and again and again. And you see this wonderful story of grace in Vivekananda too. Do you remember after Ramakrishna died, Vivekananda's telling M, he says, I want to sit down. I want to make a commitment to sit here and meditate until I realize God or die. And and M says, well, why don't you go ahead and do it? And he says, well, what if I get hungry? And what does M say? M says, so eat something and begin again. Don't call it failure because you forgot. Don't call it failure because you went off the track a little bit. Simply put your mind back at the feet of the divine and start again. That's all. No apology needed, no work of contortion to pay for the horrible infraction. Just put your mind back in the mind of God and keep going forward. Do not be discouraged by failure. God knows it's difficult. And just know that as great as any disappointment in your failure, so will your joy be as great when it is attained, which is his long-winded way of saying it's worth it. Make the effort. It's worth it. You will be thrilled that you did it, that you developed this habit. It is not right that the heart, which is the seat of life governing the rest of the body, should be the first and last to love and worship God, both in beginning and finishing our works, spiritual and temporal, and generally throughout the business of life. It is the heart, therefore, that must ensure this turning to God, which, as I have already said, can more easily be done spontaneously and without study. It's not something that happens in the mind. It's not just a sheer act of will. There's something more. It's the letting go of the changing. It's the letting go of mind, the letting go of body, and reposing in the soul. That's why we call it spiritual life. What does it mean to be spiritual? It means to be identified as a spirit. That's what spiritual means. You've identified as spirit, so it's the concerns of spirit that you work with. And what are the concerns of spirit? Love, wisdom, service, compassion, joy. These are the fruits of the spirit. This is what it is to be identified as spirit. What is it to be identified with the body? It's hunger. It's a need for pleasure. It's a decay. What is it to be identified with mind? It's a loneliness. It's a depression. It's a constant anxiety of change and stress. But to identify with spirit, it's infinite. It's mercy. It's love. It's grace. And those who have managed to do it, those are the Buddhas, the Krishnas, the Jesus, the Ramakrishnas, that we honor, that the world never forgets, because we've seen something through them. We've touched something through them that we know is true, that we know is golden, that we know is worth everything to have and to celebrate. So it is the heart, and that's why we're talking about here, the shrine here. It is the heart, therefore, that must ensure this turning to God, which, as I have already said, can more easily be done spontaneously and without study. Right? And why does he feel the need to say that? Because we're so used to living up here that we think anytime we need to learn or know something, this is where we have to go study. We have to go get information. But it's not here. Why? Because this isn't information that comes from there. It's the information of isness, right? Eckhart Tolle says that his first amazement was that there was more understanding, there was more wisdom and more knowledge in the silence of the peace within the soul than there ever was in any educated mind, and more so than anything that could be put in the head. So know this. It is helpful for those who undertake this practice. Oh my goodness, it's 8:06. Let's do this one and then we'll stop. It is helpful for those who undertake this practice to use interiorly short ejaculations such as, "My God, I am wholly thine. O God of love, I love you with all my heart. Lord, make my heart excuse me, old age here. Lord, make my heart like unto thine," or any other such words as love may suggest at the moment. But care must be taken that the mind does not wander and return again to the world. What is that? Return again to the changing. Right? Don't get caught up here again in all these ideas and projections and plannings and all of that stuff. Don't go in there. That's the world. But care must be taken that the mind does not wander and return again to the world. Keep it turned to God only, so that, controlled and subdued by will, it cannot but rest in God. Right? So it's returning to that knowledge, sitting in that knowledge. Don't let it get caught up in the changing. That's why we chant the name of God. Om. Because as you're saying Om, the mind can do nothing else but hear that response. Om. Anytime the mind begins to argue, you just start Om. And the mind is captive. The mind cannot break away. So bring the mind back and live a life that is inspired and not driven. That's the difference between a life in the mind and a life in the heart, a life in God.